Shalom. Welcome. I'm Rabbi Scott with Beth Yeshua Messianic Synagogue in Fort Myers, Florida. We are reissuing the Revelation series that was taught by Rabbi Jim Pickens here at Beth Yeshua over the course of the last 2 years or so. We feel these messages are especially relevant in these tumultuous times, and we hope and pray that Adonai uses them to strengthen you and to encourage you. If you are currently a supporter of this ministry, we would like to say thank you. We appreciate your partnership with us as we all labor together in the work of the gospel of Yeshua in the kingdom here on earth. If you would like to support us, you will find a link below in the video description. Once again, we hope that this is a blessing to you. If you have any questions, you will find an email address. If you have any dialogue or discussion, you'll find an email address in the video description below. Please reach out to us. We'd love to hear from you. And now I will give you the Revelation series with Rabbi Jim Pickens. Shalom.
Tonight, we're going to take up Zechariah 8, and in chapter 8, we will deal with some more of the oracles that we began with last week. 7 oracles, actually, we're going to get through this evening. We're going to finish up what is, in essence, the first half of the book of Zechariah, although the first half takes up 8 chapters and just leaves us 6. But the subject matter will change a little bit more, but we're going to look at some things that are prophesied tonight. We're going to look at some things that are prophesied directly towards what's going to be happening at the end of the age as we transition into the millennium itself. I want to remind us that an oracle is a divine revelation that's given by God through a prophet, and Zechariah is a prophet. The book of Zechariah is sometimes called the Revelation of the Old Testament. What we're getting here is detailed information that we can apply when we get into the book of Revelation. And I want us to grasp as much of what we get tonight as we can because it's reapplicable. The book of the Revelation, just as an example, tells us of the 1,000-year reign of Messiah. But it gives us absolutely no real details in the book of Revelation itself, just that it starts and that it stops, but no information in between. But our Tanakh, our Old Testament, fills in with this with great detail, and what we're finding in the book of Zechariah that we're going to be looking at this evening is what the political, the religious, and the social structure of the end of the age is really prophesied to be in Israel and in Jerusalem at that period as we begin to make the transition into the millennial reign of Messiah and the millennium itself. And we're there really going through this now. So some of this is going to really make sense. This chapter 8 of Zechariah, has a lot of detail in it. So let's get started so we can get all of it in our hour this evening. Chapter 8, Zechariah, verses 1 and 2. A message came from Adonai Tzevaot. Adonai Tzevaot says, I am extremely jealous on Zion's behalf, and am jealous for her with great fury. Great fury. Hang on to fury. First verse is really just kind of a general formula verse that introduces an oracle. God is introduced here in this is Adonai Tzevaot, and Adonai Tzevaot can mean Lord of Hosts or God Almighty. The language gives emphasis to the power of God, and also it emphasized in the passage that there is zeal and passion, here termed jealousy of God. God's very passionate about his relationship with Israel and with Jerusalem. And this great zeal as we go through this chapter cannot really be understood except by its application to the covenant relationship that the Jewish people have with God. And God is going to create a new covenant with them as we work our way through this, so we'll understand a little bit more about that as well. We have to understand this covenant relationship to understand God's zeal and God's jealousy. According to the language here, God is totally devoted to his people. This language is found in many other places. The repetitive use of the word zealous or jealous, depending upon your translation, in this verse directs attention to God's intent and to his absolute commitment to Israel. The use of the English word fury here denotes the intensity on God's part to this relationship. The English word fury here denotes the intensity on God's part to this relationship. Many of the English translations that are out there tend to give the idea that this great jealousy of God's is directed towards Israel and the people Israel, but the true translation of this should indicate that the fury or wrath is on Israel's behalf, directed at the nations of the world. That's what we're going to be seeing in this verse. The fury is coming out here when the nations move against Israel and try to attack Israel. And God is jealous of Zion with great fury, with a great wrath on the nation Israel's behalf. Still in Zechariah 8, verse 3, please. Adonai says, I am returning to Zion. I will live in Jerusalem. Then Jerusalem will be called Truth City. Hang on to Truth City. Adonai Tzevaot's mountain, the mountain of the Holy One. It says, then Jerusalem will be called Truth City, Adonai Tzevaot's mountain, the mountain of the Holy One. Very direct statement here. We're talking about the millennial period. Here Adonai is saying that he will not only return to Zion, he will live in Jerusalem. And the verse begins by stating that the Lord will return. This coming of the Lord to Jerusalem will inaugurate a whole new era in Israel and in Jerusalem, and that's what we call the millennium. The thought here is that his return is as good as accomplished. When this was given to Zechariah, or through Zechariah, the thought here is that his return is as good as accomplished. The language here is in the perfect tense, that Adonai's return has already really begun. And when it is fully realized, the return will have profound implication for Israel and for all of mankind. We'll see that, I believe, thoroughly as we go through this chapter. Let me quote you the English translation of the Stone edition of Tanakh for this Zechariah 8:3, which pictures really greatly the concept that this is already a fait accompli. They say in that translation, thus said Hashem, I have returned to Zion, and I have made my dwelling in the midst of Jerusalem. In other words, he says, I'm going to do it. That means it's as good as done. In God's mind in eternity, it's a done deal when it's given to Zechariah. The replacement theologians, I think, really are going to have some fun explaining their theory before he is thrown in the light of that specific passage. When this happens, when he returns, Jerusalem will be called Truth City. The Hebrew used here is Ha-emet. Ha-emet for Truth City. Ha-emet means a firmness or stability, a perpetuity, a faithfulness, a fidelity. That really is talking about Truth City. And this can only be understood in terms of the new covenant. We'll get into that as it's further developed in this chapter. The concept here is the establishing of justice in society. This truth city, a place where righteousness and justice dwells, will be that place when Adonai, God's presence, is restored into Jerusalem. When this is restored into Jerusalem, the ideals of justice as set out in His Word will actually be realized. It further states that Jerusalem will be Adonai Tzevaot's mountain, the mountain of the Holy One. The Lord has once again chosen to dwell on His mountain, which is crowned by His temple. The mountain will be called Holy Mountain because of His presence. Let's go to Ezekiel chapter 48 and verse 35. The perimeter of the city will be just under 6 miles long, and from that day on the name of the city will be Adonai Shammah. Adonai is there. This is the last verse at the end of a long dissertation about the temple and the temple that's being built for the millennium. This temple description begins in chapter 40 and comes all the way down to ending with this statement in chapter 48. The perimeter of the city will be just under 6 miles long, and from that day on the name of the city will be Adonai Shammah. Adonai is there. Can you imagine Jerusalem, it says in Revelation, and is going to be given a new name, but it doesn't tell us in Revelation. Well, here it just told us. Go to Isaiah 4, 5, and 6, please. Adonai will create over the whole site of Mount Zion and over those who assemble there a smoking cloud by day and a shining flaming fire by night, for the glory will be over everything like a chuppah. A sukkah will give shade by day from the heat. It will also provide refuge and cover from storm and rain. Understand, just in reading that, we need to know that the glory will be over everything when this cloud descends. That's what we're asking for our congregation, is for the glory to be over us. And it will be over everything like a chuppah. A chuppah is a wedding canopy. A chuppah is a wedding canopy. Consider this, that in Zechariah 8, God is saying, I will live in Jerusalem. If we think about this, Yeshua has stepped down on the Mount of Olives from this cloud that we've just read about being described here. I believe this is the cloud that He returns in, the one described in Ezekiel chapter 1. And we need to read Ezekiel chapter 1 and know this, so put that on your homework list. Read through Ezekiel chapter 1. This cloud is really just hanging over Zion, over the Temple Mount, like a chuppah, like a wedding canopy. And all of those that are in the city are those that are written down for life. They are then under this wedding canopy. It says that we are to be the bride of Messiah. There is the wedding canopy hanging over the place that He is returning to. This is when God returns to Zion. And I'm not going to spend any more time here tonight because we've got too much territory to cover, but we'll explore this whole thing a lot more when we get into Revelation. Zechariah 8, 4 and 5, please. Adonai Tzevaot says, old men and old women will once again sit in open places of Jerusalem, each one with a cane in his hand because of their great age. The cane really is symbolic here of the great age. It's not because they're old and decrepit at that point. The city's open places will also be full of boys and girls playing there. We're talking about more detail at the end time. We're talking about the city of God, Jerusalem, at the time when Adonai dwells there, this being during the millennium period. This is not eternity, this is during the millennium. Verse 4 gives an insight into these times long life will be common. Long life will be very common during the millennium. A usual occurrence. Old people will be free of the demands of labor and have leisure together in public places without a bomb going off. Which, if you're an old folk and you're coming into the beginning of the millennium, bombs have been coming in from Arab villages. Apparently, these older people will be able to do this in a state of good health, even though they have canes indicating very advanced years. Most probably, there won't be anything like what we call today nursing homes. And the kind of care that we have now, because old people's bodies today deteriorate, but they're not going to deteriorate when we get to that point where we receive our new bodies as the man comes back that's going to rule not only the millennium but forever. It's a time of peace and prosperity in the land involved here. Verse 5 is interesting because the older people are now contrasted with children. The streets of Jerusalem are filled with boys and girls playing in parks and in open places. It could indicate an era of large families. Children will be able to spend their early years in ideal freedom from untimely burdens, and they won't have to deal with the things that are going on in Jerusalem now, such as having to watch out for the guy next to you to make sure he isn't out to get you. This is not showing any concept of poverty and war in this. Let's go to Isaiah 65:19, please. I will rejoice in Jerusalem. This is Adonai speaking, Yeshua speaking actually. I will rejoice in Jerusalem and take joy in my people. The sound of weeping will no longer be heard in it, Jerusalem, no longer the sound of crying. No more will babies die in infancy. No more will an old man die short of his age. He who dies at 100 will be thought young, and at less than 100 thought cursed. Next. They will build houses and live in them. They will plant vineyards and eat their fruit. They will not build and others live there. You get to outlive your house. They will not plant and others eat, for the days of my people will be like the days of a tree, and my chosen will themselves enjoy the use of what they make. This is one of the passages of many that talks about this specific time in Jerusalem, what a swell place it's going to be, and how totally under the auspices of God with no Satan built in. Gives us a little more insight. People will outlive their dwellings. Just think about that. It will be an absolutely wonderful time to be in Jerusalem as compared to, say, right now. Zechariah 8:6, please. Adonai Tzava'ot says, this may seem amazing to the survivors in those days, but must it also seem amazing to me? Says Adonai Tzava'ot. You see, he's talking about what we've just looked at. This may seem amazing to the survivors in those days, but must this also seem amazing to me? This is an interesting statement. This is a remnant here that's in Jerusalem. This remnant is a special group within the society of Israel, those that are in a special relationship with their God. This time will seem amazing to these old-timers in lieu of the difficulties that they had experienced in getting to this place. Those people that live at that time will have experienced really probably some of the most terrible times as we're going to see ever happen to Israel. So it'll be absolutely amazing to them that they're living like this now. They can hardly believe it. But Adonai is saying, for him, the task cannot be that very difficult. God says, should I also be amazed? Should I also be amazed that I've done this? See, nothing is too difficult for our God. Zechariah 8 still, verses 7 and 8. Adonai Tzava'ot says, I will save my people from lands east and west. I will bring them back, and they will live in Jerusalem. They will be my people, and I will be their God with faithfulness and justice. This statement has the end times cast to it. I will save my people from the east to the west. There's a verbal conjugate in Hebrew called hayfeel. Is anybody here familiar with a passage in Hebrew that is hayfeel? A hayfeel means causative in English. Hayfeel is causative. This statement is made in the hayfeel. God is saying, I will cause my people to be saved from the east and from the west. I will make it happen. I will cause it. I will cause them to be delivered. This is an actual translation. I will cause to be delivered. Very powerful form of the verb being used here. This oracle is the fourth of 7 oracles, and it sort of constitutes a climax right in the center of the oracles, much like we did earlier. We work our way in from each side, but what's in the center is really what's the climax of everything. And what we've just looked at is kind of the climax of these 7 oracles, the central theme here at their center. All of the oracles have this end-time focus. Now it says, I will save my people from the lands east and west. Many believe this expresses a totality. I believe that it expresses a totality. Before in Zechariah, we had east, west, north, and south. Why would this, when it's only 2 directions given, express totality? Scholars have always had no problem identifying with Babylonia and all of that area as being east, but they've had difficulty understanding west in a literal way. The term here, if literally translated, is stated in this fashion: from the land of the sunrise to the land of the going in of the sun. Doesn't say east and west. It only implies east and west, which the translators grab. But generally, it's considered everything that the sun shines on. Everything, everywhere. Wherever people are, that's where God will save his remnant people from and will bring them back. In essence, it's saying here that God himself will rescue them. This is another hayfeel conjugate, if you will. God will cause them to be rescued, and they will live in Jerusalem. Now consider this. Back in verse 3, God stated that he was going to live in Jerusalem. Now here he's saying that he's going to rescue his people out of the lands where they are, and they will live in Jerusalem. They were bringing all of this stuff at the end of the age together. The end-time focus of this return of the people is taken with the return of God to Zion. They will be my people, and I will be their God. We can understand this in context with the new covenant. Go to Jeremiah 31:30, and I'm going to go through this very slowly in pieces. Verse 30, rather each will die for his own sin. Everyone who eats sour grapes, his own teeth will be set on edge. I left that in there to introduce this because this points to a generally paganized world of the time. And all of those, each is going to die from his own sin, of his own sin. Everyone who eats sour grapes, his teeth will be set on edge. The new covenant that's coming from this will apply to his faithful remnant, not those that are going to die of their own sin. So picking this up, and then verse 31, he says, here the days are coming, says Adonai, when I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and the house of Judah. Hang on to that thought. It says that God is going to make a new covenant with the house of Israel and the house of Judah. but not anybody else. The language, if we look back in Zechariah 8:8, is saying that they will be my people and I will be their God. And this is making a statement that is identical to the language of Jeremiah 31 that we've just read here. I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and the house of God. See how God is finishing this up? Go to the next slide, please. Verse 32, it will not be like the covenant I made with their fathers on the day that I took them by their hand and brought them out of Egypt, because they, for their part, violated my covenant, even though I, for my part, was a husband to them. Whoa. See, the reason we're going to be under the wedding canopy as a remnant in that passage that we looked at earlier is because God has always wanted to be in a relationship with his people like husband and wife. Verse 33, for this is the covenant I will make with the house of Israel after those days, says Adonai. I will put my Torah within them and write it on their hearts. I will be their God and they will be my people. Whoa! Next. No longer will any of them teach his fellow community member or his brother, know Adonai, for all will know me, from the least of them to the greatest, because I will forgive their wickedness and remember their sins no more. Understand something. This is talking about the remnant. See, I will be their God in faithfulness and justice. Here God is guaranteeing a performance in the new order that he's going to lay out. It's found in the new covenant. The people are bound to God as his people, and he is bound to remain in a relationship with them. So much for replacement theology. This relationship, God says, will never be severed. All the requirements are to be observed without ceasing. This will be the prevailing righteousness. Now, we begin to see why this will be called Truth City. Because of this covenant relationship between God and the people in the city. Zechariah 8:9. Adonai Tzavaot says, take courage, you who are hearing only now. In these days, these words spoken by the prophets when the foundation was being laid for the rebuilding of the temple, the house of Adonai Tzavaot. I'm going to read through that again because I want us to have a grasp on this. Adonai Tzavaot says, take courage, you who are hearing only now. In these days, these words spoken by the prophets when the foundation was being laid for the rebuilding of the temple, the house of Adonai Tzavaot. What this is saying here really is twofold. It applies to those living in that day who might not have been there when it was originally spoken and it's being repeated for them, but it also applies to us today that are hearing it for the very first time. I'm going to go through this again because I want us to understand this. What this is saying is twofold. It is, number one, referring to when Zechariah lived and when he was given this prophecy, and a nice speaking words of encouragement to the people at the time that had not heard the contemporary prophets at the time of the laying of the foundation of the temple. This is being repeated so that it can be understood. Haggai was another prophet that was giving this same kind of information out at exactly the same time that Zechariah was prophesying. Haggai would have been one of those contemporary prophets. If you haven't heard these words before that have been given, here they are again. Take courage in them. That's for those people there that are trying to get the second temple rebuilt. Then there's number two. We have to pay attention as well, as Adonai has been prophesying ahead throughout this passage, to what appears to be our time. So we need to be particularly paying attention if we're hearing these words for the first time. Very complex little verse. Zechariah 8, 10, and 11, please. For prior to that time, going back to the Zechariah's time, for prior to that time, there were wages neither for people nor animals. Moreover, it was unsafe for anyone to go out or come in. It's going to get that way in Israel and Jerusalem again in our time before we reach the actual beginning of the 1,000 years. Moreover, pick that up again in the middle of verse 10. Moreover, it was unsafe for anyone to go out and come in because of the enemy, for I set all people each against the other. Verse 11, from now on I will not treat the remnant of this people as I did before. Whoa, we just changed directions right there between verses 10 and 11. But from now on I will not treat the remnant of this people as I did before. The remnant that's going to be selected, the remnant that will be at the end of the age, will not be treated in the manner that Israel at large was treated before. Here the prophecy reflects back to a time prior to the destruction of Jerusalem, to the poverty and the insecurity that was part of what those people experienced. Both men and animals suffered in the destruction caused by the Babylonians. Not only was an outside enemy the cause of these conditions, but also a breakdown of normal social interaction among the people themselves was involved in this. There was misunderstanding, resentment, animosity. God set people one against the other. God withheld his blessing, and the result was poverty, insecurity, and broken relationships. If God is not in charge, all other relationships break down. And that is really what happened. It was a composite of things, external as well as internal. This passage refers back to that. But then God says, from now on, I will not treat the remnant of this people as I did before. That era will have passed when we reach the millennium. The repentance of the people, which is evidenced by their willingness to rebuild the temple, is the basis of God dealing with them differently. See, he dealt differently with those people that he brought back to Israel from the Babylonian exile to rebuild his temple. He's going to deal differently with the people that he's going to be having rebuild the third temple, the temple where he's going to occupy and live. This rebuilding of the temple in Zechariah's era, back in the day of Zechariah, is a foreshadowing of when the remnant comes in at the millennial and yet another temple is built. This is looking forward to that future time. Zechariah 8:12, please. Now they will sow in peace. The vine will give its fruit. The ground will produce its yield. The sky will give its due. And I will cause the remnant. See, we're talking only of the remnant now. I will cause the remnant of this people to possess all these things, the house of Judah and the house of Israel. Just as you were formerly a curse among the nations, so now I will save you, and you will be a blessing. Don't be afraid. Take courage. That's powerful. That's powerful. This is an expression of the inheritance from God to his faithful remnant. Say that again. This is an expression of the inheritance of God to his faithful remnant. They will sow in peace. The vine will give its fruit. The land will be fruitful. Or perhaps the fruit of the vine is the remnant itself. We can see there's a lot going on in this. The sky will give sufficient rain, and God will cause. There's that causative, that nephil again. God will cause the remnant to possess these things. This has to be understood as an anticipation of the new covenant, because it states in the next verse that the remnant here is both Israel and Judah. The remnant is made up from both Israel and Judah. The return of this combined remnant is who's going to build the new temple of God. This is yet to happen. Historically has never happened because we haven't been united again. People are back in the land, have been now for 70 years, but are not separated yet from the pagans of those, are the faithful remnant that will build this millennial temple. We'll see prophecy of this separation of the faithful remnant when we get to Zechariah chapter 13. We're going to mention it here in a minute, but we'll deal with it and we'll go in detail in chapter 13. Now, just basics. Just basics. The reason Israel and Judah have been cursed amongst the nations is that they have put themselves in a position where they had to be cast out by God. This is not just a restoration of the southern tribes, Judah, Benjamin, and Simeon, but also the northern tribes. And from those, God will extract a faithful remnant. The third that he brings through the fire. Again, that speaks ahead to chapter 13. God says, I will save you and you will be a blessing. That is saying that this remnant will be blessed by God, therefore becoming a blessing to the nations, actively become a blessing to the nations. Blessed to be a blessing is a huge biblical concept. That's the basis for Jabez prayer. How many people know about Jabez prayer? All right, for those of you who don't, write down this address. 1 Chronicles 4, verses 9 and 10. You need to be familiar with that. Zechariah here sees the reunion of the two kingdoms with Jerusalem as a capital. Later we'll see Jerusalem exalted as a religious center for all nations. So we're going to go from just Jerusalem being the capital of Judah to Jerusalem being the capital of both Judah and Israel again, and then ultimately the capital of the world, all nations. 10 goyim, I love this. 10 Gentiles will grab the hold of the cloak of one Jew. The last of verse 13 is another morale booster. It says, don't be afraid, take courage. Don't be afraid, take courage. Because in the new covenant, there is no occasion for fear. There will be no occasion for fear. The thought here is not passive, but take an active part in the promises of God. In other words, as this is going on, don't go hide under a rock someplace. Get ourselves involved. Take courage could also be translated, let yourself be strong. Let your resolve be strong. Go to Philippians 2:12, please. So, my dear friends, this is Paul, the Rav Shaul, speaking. So, my dear friends, just as you have always obeyed when I was with you, it is even more important that you obey now when I am away from you. Keep working out your deliverance with fear and trembling. For God is the one working among you, both the willing and the working for what pleases him. See, some are working to do what pleases themselves. Some are working for what pleases God. Verse 13, for God is the one working among you, both the willing and the working for what pleases himself. Don't be afraid. Let your resolve be strong. And then let's look at verse 14, Philippians 2:14. Do everything without kvetching or arguing. Do we understand kvetching? Complaining. That's Yiddish. Do everything without kvetching or arguing, so that you may be blameless and pure children of God. Blameless and pure children of God. That's really speaking of a righteous remnant, of the righteous remnant of Zechariah chapter 8. It's much better to look at New Testament through the lens of Torah, I believe, than Torah through the lens of the New Testament. If we bring Torah in, we can better understand what's written in the Brit Hadashah. Zechariah 8:14. For Adonai Tzevaot says, just as I resolved to do harm when your forefathers provoked me, Adonai Tzevaot says, and I did not relent, so now I resolve to do good to Jerusalem and to the house of Judah, so don't be afraid. Things are going to have changed totally. This makes it clear to us that God is determined that the destruction of Jerusalem and the end of Jewish independence because of failure to heed the word of earlier prophets, that's gone. Just as kind of an aside here, how much more evidence than this would we need to not ignore any part of the Word of God? God said, this is what you have to do. We said we don't have to do that, and God trashed them. That's the simple story. God said, this is what you have to do to his people. They said we don't have to do that, and God trashed them. Sent them out, away from himself. Now, we can't get the idea that these nations that did in first Israel and then Judah were simply more powerful nations, and that's what allowed them to do this. Basically, their power had really nothing to do with that, although God used more powerful nations, but they would have never touched Israel except that God determined that it would be done that way. Just as right now, God will determine what goes on in Israel in this day and age. I think everything that's going on in Israel today has absolutely been determined by God. We've looked at too much of it to not believe that. It doesn't matter how many nations there are becoming involved in what's coming up. It will be God alone that determines what's going to happen with Israel. It's pictured for us here in the history of Israel. It says here, I had determined to bring disaster to you. Now I have determined to do good, and this good will ultimately be done, regardless of what the nations of the earth think about it. God is now really determined to restore his people. This promise extends to Jerusalem and to all Israel. And the admonition is don't be afraid. Don't be afraid is directed to Adonai's faithful remnant. Those claiming to be secular in Israel today really need to be reconsidering what they are and become the faithful remnant or part of it. And there will be a large group do that. We understand that Zechariah is writing to both the time, his time, and the future. The theme is carried on, don't fear, giving courage to the people. God is in charge. Don't fear, God is in charge. There's still trial and tribulation to be faced, both at the time that this was being written down and at the time that's to come in our future. We're, I think, in the midst of it now, beginning, because we're talking about things in Israel. We'll get into the time to come more in the next chapters. So that's going to become, I believe, very, very interesting. Zechariah 8:16, please. These are the things you're to do. Speak the truth to each other. In your courts administer justice that's true and conducive to peace. Don't plot harm against each other and don't love perjury. For all these things I hate, says Adonai. Tells us things that we're supposed to do and things that we're not supposed to do. First part of this verse says, these are things that you're to do. This is parallel language to things that are in Torah and things that are in Isaiah and Jeremiah the prophets. But none of them has this exact statement. These are things that you are to do. The structure in these two verses is very similar to chapter 7, 9, and 10 that we looked at last week. Remember, there were two positive injunctions and two negative injunctions together with similar content. True judgments are commanded. Evil thoughts about others are condemned. Verse 16, for instance, requires that they speak truth to each other. What is involved in this statement is that not merely a cold, personal attribute of speaking the truth, but a quality that should prevail the whole social order needs to be in place. And judicial systems need to be the same as dealing with the social order. Remember, this is Truth City now. And that's the kind of city that it's going to be. Truth will invade the entire social order and the judicial system. In your courts, administer justice that's true and conducive to peace. This is not speaking so much as the letter of the law as it is to the spirit of the law. Don't plot harm against each other is restating chapter 7, verse 10. Don't love perjury, which is the exact opposite of the truth. Absence of justice, either in the courts or in public life. That's the absence of justice, and God hates that. I think that's probably, it just kind of lays in here, but it's as powerful a statement as made. God hates the absence of justice. God loves truth, but hates perjury. His city will be Truth City. This has to be at the exclusion of the lie. You shall not lie. Zechariah 8:18. This word of Adonai Tzevaot came to me. Adonai Tzevaot says, the fast days of the 4th, 5th, 7th, and 10th months are to become times of joy, gladness, and cheer for the house of Judah. Therefore, love, truth, and peace. Remember, we just went through this in chapter 7. The delegation came to God and asked, do we have to keep doing the fast and mourning of the 5th month? And God, right there, when they hit him with that, upped the ante by including the 7th month. Well, now God strikes again. He's included 2 more months in this, so now we have the 4th, 5th, 7th, and 10th months. All were fasting and lamenting days, and these aren't going to be days of fasting anymore. They will cease to be days of fasting. They're going to be days of joy, gladness, and cheer. The 4th month was when the city walls were breached by the Babylonians. The 5th month was when the temple was destroyed. The 7th month was when the last token ruler of Judah was killed. The breaching of the walls in the 4th month ended David's rule. A man named Gedaliah was appointed as governor of Judah. When he was assassinated, the last vestige of rule of Judah by a Jew disappeared. And the 10th month is the beginning of the siege of Jerusalem by the Babylonians. These are the 4 months in which mourning days were set aside because of the disasters that befell Judah. Think about this. But these disasters ultimately brought correction, because these disasters were about things of rebellion of the people, and God separated himself from them and ultimately worked towards just bringing in a group of his redeemed. God is saying here that the commemoration of these sad events are to become times of joy and gladness. Why? Because everything has exactly been reversed. The things that caused these things that you're mourning about has all been changed now because of what took place after these events occurred. These events caused change to begin to set in and take place within Israel. The verse ends with the admonition, love, truth, and peace, and this again underlines the whole new covenant relationship. The ethics set out in the new covenant as a condition for blessing. Zechariah 8:20, please. Adonai Tzevaot says, in the future, peoples and inhabitants of many cities will come. Where are they going to come? Jerusalem. The inhabitants of one city will travel to another and say, we must go to ask Adonai's favor and consult Adonai. And the answer they'll get is, I will go too. I'll go too. Verse 22, yes, many peoples and powerful nations will come to consult Adonai Tzevaot in Jerusalem and to ask Adonai's favor. Wow. This is interesting. What a time I think this is going to be. At this time, as these times occur, the term peoples will include all races and nationalities. The inhabitants of distant cities will encourage each other to find God. Can you just imagine the inhabitants of Paris encouraging the people of Berlin to find God? You know, for just what's been through in my lifetime. Inhabitants of distant cities will encourage each other to find God. The borders on these places really are incomprehensible to us at the moment. But that's what's being said here. The term to ask God's favor indicates that they will travel up to Jerusalem. The borders will mean nothing anymore. They will travel up to Jerusalem to seek God. In verse 22 we see, even though God's messages of the nations was condemnation. All the way looking through here we found condemnation of the nations. Even though God's message to the nation was condemnation, it's God's desire that nations and individuals choose salvation. It's the national blessing or curse and the individual blessing or curse. Simply because the nations are under a curse doesn't mean that individuals or even the nations themselves can't be blessed if they will repent. It's God's intention that they choose salvation. What is to occur at Jerusalem and Mount Zion is to pave the way for many people and strong nations to easily search for God, to find their God, to come into the presence of their God, seeking Him. Jerusalem will essentially become the center of the world. We need to think about that. Keep that in mind. We have to understand when we get into Revelation, we'll see even more about this in regard to when Yeshua rules from Jerusalem. He's going to rule with an iron rod. He's going to rule with an iron rod. All the nations of the earth will recognize that Jerusalem is the center of all power and the center of all righteousness, the center of all truth. It will be Truth City. Now, Zechariah 8:23. Adonai Tzevaot says, when that time comes, 10 men will take hold, speaking all the languages of the nations, will grab hold of the cloak of a Jew and say, we want to go with you because we have heard that God is with you. This pictures the end-time world view. The Gentiles form a minyan. A minyan requires a minimum of 10 men. The Gentiles form a minyan. 10 men from all of the nations will grab the cloak of a Jew. 10 goyim for every Jew. Look at that word cloak up there again for a minute. I'm fond of taking that word cloak to mean mantle. Your mantle is something a little different in definition than your cloak. The goyim are going to be grabbing onto the mantle of the Jew. And I don't think just any Jew, but the mantle of the Messianic Jew. Our mantle is what our cloak is. Our mantle is our covering. Mantle seems stronger in this sense. In Revelation 12:17 it says, Satan will try to destroy a specific remnant of Israel, those that keep Torah and bear witness to Yeshua. Satan will try to destroy a specific remnant of Israel, those that keep Torah and bear witness to Yeshua. That is the mantle that the Goyim seek to grasp hold of from us, keeping Torah and bearing witness to Yeshua. 10 men from all nations will grab the cloak, the mantle of one Messianic Jew. That means hundreds of thousands, actually of millions, because we know, coming up in part of these prophecies we're looking at, that 1/3 of Israel will become Messianic. If we just take the Jews in Israel alone, that's over 3 million. So 30 million Gentiles are going to grab a hold of those. And then if we take the Jews that are scattered, the Israelites that are scattered throughout the world, that come into the same relationship, and I believe that third is applicable, it grows even more. Wow. At Exodus 4:4, we have an interesting use of this take hold or grab hold of. 3 times this happens in the Hebrew. In Exodus 4:4, Moses grabs hold or takes hold of the serpent by the tail, and it becomes a rod or a staff. Second one is in 1 Samuel 17:35, where young David has come to see his brothers and Goliath there, and he says, I'll take care of Goliath. And he's asked, what kind of background do you have for this? And David says, when the lion came into the sheep herd, I grabbed a hold of the lion by the jaw. The same language. And this language is used in those 2 places, and it's used here. The fact is, in all 3 of these cases, the one who grabbed hold of couldn't afford to let go. Moses couldn't afford to let go of the servant. David couldn't afford to let go of the lion's jaw. Well, I'm here to tell you that the Goyim are not going to be able or affording to let go of the Messianic Jew as we go through this period and they're searching. The one who keeps Torah and bears witness to Yeshua. God's interested in all of the nations being saved. And in that particular time, he's going to use the Messianic Jews in an extremely powerful way, laid out here for us. The people of other nations, those that are wanting to be done with their paganism, will ask for the privilege of accompanying Messianic Jews. Those that are believers in Messiah, as this is going down, but have a replacement theology, are all going to be asking for the privilege of accompanying Messianic Jews so that they can find God. This is going to be something that's going to be huge when we get to that time. Can you imagine what it will be like in Jerusalem at that time? We'll see even more of this when we get into Zechariah 14. People whose doctrine is affected by replacement theology never teach these verses. Do we understand why? They can't, because these verses are saying very directly how the end times are going to be. What's going to happen at the end time is the plan that God has had for his people all of these centuries, and it's all been written down. It will be carried out to its fullest extent. The salvation of the pagan actually will be through the Jew, the Messianic Jew. We'll close with that.